lecture of Wave APIs, and I'm going to give a quick one on behalf of WaveVS.net in Spain.
All right, sorry to break up riveting discussions. You guys will have the whole afternoon to keep them going. So I worked on the Wave APIs for the last year and did a lot of fielding of developers' feature requests and did a lot of discussion of what the API should look like. When we launched Google Wave to developers last year, we started with we had a basic robots API, version 1, and we had a basic gadget API, and that was basically it. And then in the course of the year, we revised the robots API to do V2, which is what you guys are probably familiar with now. What? Oh yeah, sorry. And then we also introduced an embed API and also Wave this and also a Wave data API, which was like an authenticated user version of the Wave robot API. So we actually made a lot of progress on the APIs during the year, but they're definitely still drafts, and there's still a lot of things that they could be, a lot of features they could have, and also sometimes completely different ways of doing those APIs. So since you guys are going to be doing your own Wave servers and presumably probably going to be supporting the APIs, I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the ideas that we had about what features we would add or what APIs we would add. All right, so one type of API was the extensions. How many of you guys actually used the APIs during the last year? Okay, a fair few. All right, and presumably most of you have actually used a gadget and used a robot in your waves. So for extensions, we have robots and we have gadgets. So for robots, the whole idea was programmatic manipulation of the waves. And just to remind you what robot code looks like, this is a really basic Python robot, right? We have a profile, we register for events, we respond to the events by doing some actions on the blip or on the wavelet or on the participants, right? So that's our basic robot API. So the ways we wanted to extend it is first just in terms of features. The whole point of robots is that they should be able to do what human users can do, and we got robots close to that, but there was still a lot that they were missing. Right? And if robots can't do everything humans can do, they're really pretty handicapped. So one of the big things was being able to manipulate the conversation model, being able to actually move threads, move blips around. We had really basic conversation model support, but nothing like what people wanted, because they wanted robots that could actually restructure these conversations. Another thing was for robots to be able to search their own waves that they were on. A user can search their waves, robots should be able to as well. Another thing is having robots actually able to be a part of a group. One of the big issues is that with the way our permissions model worked, a robot couldn't actually add a group to a wave if that group had restricted permissions, right? Because a group is saying like, all right, the only people that can add this to the wave are people that are in this group, because that's like posting to the wave. Nice. Spam. Getting those all day. So we were trying to come up with a way where robots could actually be members of a group, because that way they would have permission to do it. So you could just associate, if you had like addresses and associate that with the group, maybe you could do it. That's something to think about when you're thinking about the group support and also permissions. Another thing was having access to the multiple revisions of the wave. In the current API, you just get the version at which the event happened. But a lot of people wanted history access, and also along with that, restore access. A human user can go through history and they can hit restore when they see a version they want to go back to. That's something that robots would find useful as well. And this is sort of related to robots, also just related to permissions in general. In Wave, in the permissions model, there was like one owner of a wave, and that owner had some special properties, like only the owner could set other people on the wave as read-only. So since there was this concept of owner, we needed to be able to have robots own waves, which they could do by creating it. But a lot of times you'd add a robot to a wave and actually want that robot to be an owner and have all those owner capabilities as well. So this would need both modification in robots and just in permissions model generally, is you need the idea of being able to say that there are multiple owners of a wave and being able to delegate and say this person can also be an owner and has all those owner responsibilities. and privileges. So that was all capabilities for robots. There's also just, in terms of the API, the usability of the API. Like right now, when you wanted to actually modify blips, you would have to create image elements and set their attributes and append them. Or you could do this append HTML operation, which would be kind of like doing a copy. It was basically like doing a copy and paste of HTML into a wave. It was calling that code. But the problem is that when you did this, HTML is nice because, we all know how to write out HTML. We write it out. We've got this massive blob of content that we're going to put into the wave. It's cool. It's styled. But then it doesn't really represent what it's going to become in wave world. So you don't actually know for sure what the indices are going to be when you do HTML. So we contemplated in having some sort of wave markup language, not to introduce like more markup languages, but some way that you could just pass in a string that represented both your content and your style, similar to how you do in HTML, and have that be conveyed to the wave, and have all the indices be predictable. But we didn't actually really figure out what that looks like, and that would also be advantageous because right now, if you're going to do like append text and style it, and append text and style it, like if you do, for example, Syntaxy was a robot that syntax highlighted code, so it would like change the color like every 3 characters. So every time it would set the style annotation for the color, that would be another operation. So Syntaxy actually did more operations than like any other robot because every single one of those was a separate operation. So the other advantage of having wave markup is that you can do all this styling in one operation. So it really reduces the number of operations you're sending to the server. So it should make it faster as well. A lot of you want to be able to copy a blip or just copy a range, like say from character here to character here, copy both the contents and the annotations. It was a very common use case to actually want to copy stuff from one place to the other. We also talked about having some API that didn't actually require you to host something on a server, right? There were some robots I wrote that were literally one line of code, but I had to deploy like a whole App Engine app just for that one line of code, right? I had one that would just remove all the formatting from all the style annotations from a wave. I shouldn't really have to run a robot in a server to do that because that's a very simple operation. So we thought about some sort of API that they wouldn't have to run their own server for. Now, either it could be a JavaScript API that's been sanitized that can actually run inside the context of the wave, or it could be maybe a JavaScript API that we ran on our own servers, so that at least they didn't have to run their server. And Google Apps Script is a good example of this. Google Apps Script is actually you write it in JavaScript, and it gets run on the Google Apps servers against your current Docker spreadsheet. But that was something, and that would also make testing a lot easier too. And it would also make the lib more aligned with gadgets because gadgets are all JavaScript, right? So right now, if you wanted to do something that involved both robots and gadgets, you had to learn, Python, JSON, XML, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So that's quite a lot of things to learn. Like, granted, a lot of web developers know it, but if you can simplify that stack so everything's JavaScript or something like that, yeah, I think that would make it a lot easier for developers. And finally, we wanted this idea of a personal robot, or maybe you call it a robot as an agent. But when you put a robot on a wave, it's basically acting as another user, and that makes sense in some cases. But sometimes you want a robot that's just acting on your behalf and acting as you. So Spelly and Linky, those are agents, and they basically act like they're you. Like they correct spelling, and it looks like that you have that great spelling. They add links, and it looks like you did it. So a really common time we'd want this is for like emotion robots, right? I would add my favorite emotion robot to a wave because I wanted to convert my colons and parentheses to smiley faces. But that doesn't mean that everybody else on the wave wanted to convert them. And in fact, a lot of times they didn't. And I think some people might have hated me for my prolific use of emoticon robots. So ideally, I'd be able to say, like, listen, on every wave of mine, run emoticon-y as me, right? So it would just be running as an agent or a personal robot and represent its actions as me. So that would require some settings and maybe some thought about what that would mean in terms of what the robots could do. but it's definitely something that that we wanted for very simple cases, just like the emotions one. The other way you can think about it is just letting people write agents. There's multiple ways of thinking about that. All right, so going on to gadgets. So the whole point of gadgets was to be able to do basically, little collaborative web apps inside of a wave while still retaining wavy qualities and making it so we could do really extend wave from textual editing to visual editing, visual collaboration. So gadgets are really simple. I think I have an example here. So basically gadgets is a web page that's embedded inside some XML metadata, and all it does is it has a shared state, which is a hash map. It submits delta to that shared state, and on the state callback it will render the new information about the state. So it's a really simple API, which was good because it actually was pretty easy to use, but it could be extended to make it a bit more powerful. One thing that people found it difficult to use for was to make games, because it was very easy actually to kind of hack the state. So one thing that would make that better is if every state in the gadget state actually had a modified by and a timestamp that was set by the server. So can you imagine you have a trivia game and two people are trying to answer the question, and if you don't know what time, because this guy answers then and this guy's answer then, if they come in and you set different state keys and the server puts a timestamp and a modified by on both of them, you can then compare them and know for sure which user got to the server first and say, all right, that user was the winner. So right now you'd have to do that in JavaScript using like their local time or using some other way of getting the server time. Oh, that's pretty annoying. So modified by and timestamp would definitely help. Some people wanted gadgets to be able to actually listen to state from other gadgets within the same wave. We didn't really figure out how that would work, like if you'd have to declare multiple gadgets as a package or something like that. But that way you could make more of an application inside a wave that was composed of multiple gadgets. And then there was a lot of stuff about user experience. So the point of these gadgets is to take textual collaboration to visual collaboration while still being wavy. So we have all these things that we were lacking that would have made gadgets wavier. So one simple thing is just having participant carets, right? So when you're in the wave, you can see where somebody else is editing because they have a particular colored caret and you see their name, right? Gadgets didn't have access to those colors and they were actually computed per wave. And they also, they didn't have a good way of representing them. So one simple thing is just to pass the colors to the gadget so it can have this consistent view. Another thing is that Wave has this concept of edit versus view mode. There's a lot of confusion about how to deal with this in gadgets. Sometimes we told people that they should only let people edit the gadget in edit mode, but there were a lot of people that were very confused and couldn't figure out why they couldn't edit like a map, like why they couldn't add markers to the map because they weren't in edit mode. So we never really quite resolved like whether gadgets should be able to submit states in view mode, and that's the current way it is now, but it's something to think about from the user point of view. I think in Wave now, are we on full Wave edit mode yet? Because we recently made a change, at least internally, where when you start editing something, the entire wave becomes editable. And I think that makes the gadget situation a little bit easier, because at least you can be editing both the gadget blip and another blip at the same time. But it was confusing. Another thing is that when you wanted to have text inside a gadget, you couldn't have it be wavy text. You'd have to, if you wanted it to be collaborative text, you'd have to come up with your own way of doing that on top of this simple shared state API. And you could kind of do it, but not really that well, and it didn't feel like the same experience that you had inside the editor. So we really wanted to be able to say, like, this part of a gadget is actually a wavy text field, right? And this part of the gadget is a wavy text field. And you could have, single line text areas, multi-line text areas, and those could all be handled by OT. You could maybe represent them somewhere in the wavelet data documents or something like that, and just surface them in the UI of the gadget. There's a lot of stuff to do with sizing. There's so many different types of gadgets out there. Some of them are very small, but some of them are very large. Some of them are like full-on web apps. So we really wanted the ability to minimize, maximize, make the gadget full screen, make the wave full screen, to really make it possible to use those collaborative apps while also making them not interfere with the rest of your wave. Another thing that we wanted, which is kind of related to this, is that there's a lot of people who made these big collaborative web apps, and they wanted to like use this web app gadget while also chatting beneath it, but you'd have to like use the gadget, scroll down to the bottom, chat, use the gadget, scroll down to the bottom, and chat. So one thing we toyed with is the idea of a split scroll bar, where you could say split the scroll bar here, and then that way you can actually chat below the gadget, and not have to keep scrolling back and forth, right? And you can see that being useful not just for gadgets, but also for like editing a document, right? You have your one blip that's like your main document blip, and then beneath that maybe you have this more dynamic conversation going on. So if you could just split the scroll bar at these arbitrary points, and if we're going to have a random scroll bar named Scrolly, we might as well do something with it, then you can actually, it really would become a much better experience for those type of gadgets. Diff on open, when you open a wave, you can see what's changed by the yellow. It was kind of weird that you couldn't see that with gadgets. I think it was just generally a frustrating experience with gadget state updates, because your wave would go bold and you'd click on the wave, but you weren't really sure what had changed. We now pass in the diff that happened so that people could do stuff with it, but we don't really have support for diff on open. So ideally, you would open a wave, and if it was a gadget that changed, you would actually see in the gadget some visual indication that this was the changed information. Otherwise, I think users get really frustrated clicking a wave that's bold and not knowing what the hell happened, right? And along with that, in the inbox, ideally, you would actually see when something was bold that blah, blah, blah gadget was changed, or blah, blah, blah changed this gadget. So you don't even have to click the wave to know why it's been bolded. Along with that, is sometimes when you update the gadget state, you don't actually want the wave to go bold. Like, you don't want to have everyone notified that this wave has changed, because it's really not that important of a state change. One way of doing that is letting developers say, like, all right, this state change isn't going to trigger like a bolding, so you call that like no echo. Another thing is actually having different notions of state. Like, there's one state that's kind of your data state, which really represents the full data that's in the gadget. But another state could be the like user position state, right? So in Sudoku, it tracks when you play Sudoku, you see the positions of people inside the wave, and each of those is a state update. But if you're not playing Sudoku, you don't really care about it. The only people that care about the positions of the other people are the ones that are looking at that wave at that time. So you could have one state that's actually the user position state. It's like the cursor state, which we store in annotations for the rest of the wave. And that way, if you just change the cursor state, you wouldn't actually see the wave go bold. It would just be transmitted to the people that were watching. Permissions, we had on Google Wave, we had public waves that became really popular, and people would put gadgets in them, and unfortunately sometimes they put gadgets in them that were somewhat evil. So we started looking into, by evil I mean like some of them could actually redirect and break out of the frame, and do some sort of phishing thing. Some of them just used up like a lot of memory. So we wanted to do permissions at least inside public waves, so that if there was a gadget there, you could enable it for that wave, enable it always trust ones from that author, stuff like that. Like, obviously when it comes to permissions, it all comes down to the user interface and not being really, really annoying. So we had some drafts of what that would look like, but this depends really on whether you're having public waves in your particular system, or if it's more trusted, and if all of the gadgets people are using are trusted, then maybe you don't have that issue. But it's something to think about it, because gadgets can actually do a fair bit. Along that note, we wanted to have cajoled gadgets. So Kaha is a project to make it possible to have like safe JavaScript APIs that can only do basically a whitelisted set of things. Because right now we have to run gadgets in an iframe, because we don't want them to do something malicious to the area around them. But the fact that we run them in an iframe makes them actually kind of slow to load, because we've got all these iframes, and if you use like the +1 gadget, sometimes there are waves that have like 100 +1 gadgets in it, and that can get really slow to load those 100 iframes, right? So ideally, for these little gadgets that you kind of sprinkle around, you would actually be able to not use the iframe with them, not put them in an iframe, and just render the divs. But in order to do that, you have to use something like Kaha, which will basically sanitize the JavaScript and make sure that it's not using anything that it can't use. So we got pretty close to that actually, but not releasing it. Another thing is you might want to actually find a way for gadgets to go offline if offline or mobile support is important to your particular Wave instance. And we thought you could actually maybe even use the HTML5 application manifest for people to declare all the resources that their gadget uses, and then the gadget server could actually store all those resources if you go offline, so that you have a good experience if you're trying to view those things. All right, then we had installers. So installers are the way of actually using robots and gadgets, and basically an installer would put a little user interface hook somewhere into the client, and then when you clicked it, something would happen, like a gadget would get inserted in the Wave or a robot would get added to the Wave. Those are the very common ways of doing it. So here we have the waffle extension. We get a waffle on our toolbar. It inserts the waffle gadget. We add the submitting extension. We get a new Wave dropdown, and it creates a new Wave with that robot. So this was just a way of making extensions a lot more user-friendly, so that people didn't have to remember URLs every time they wanted a gadget, and they didn't have to remember addresses every time they wanted a robot, and they could make extensions actually feel like they were a native part of the Wave client, right? And we did a good job at that, but there's definitely more to do. Oops. All right, we'll just manually go down. All right, so in fact, there are a lot more hooks we wanted to add. So at that time we had the hook for the new Wave menu and the hook for the insert toolbar, but there was a lot more. And if you actually look at the extensions docs, we did document them. A lot of these were in experimental mode on Sandbox. They just never made it to non-experimental mode on preview. So one thing was a regex hook, so that when somebody typed a particular pattern that an extension recognized, the user would get would get reminded to actually put that extension on the Wave, right? So if they type a phone number, they would get a prompt that said, do you want to actually add the Twilio extension to this Wave, right? So it was just a way of actually reminding people, hey, you have an extension that can actually deal with some information that's in this Wave. And along with that, besides regex, you could also build something that recognizes addresses and let people register so that they only react when there's addresses in the Wave, or just any sort of semantic information. So that's just reminding people that there's something useful that can be done with that information in the Wave. Another thing is an attachment hook, so that when you add an attachment to the Wave and you click on that attachment, you would actually get an option to do something with that attachment. Like you could go and maybe if it was a photo, you can imagine people actually building photo editors. A lot of people wanted there to be like extendable photo editors for Wave. So you'd click on a picture and it would be like open it in Picnic. And that attachment hook would maybe insert a gadget that would let you edit that particular attachment. Welcome panel hook, that was simply just putting a button in the welcome panel, and that was pretty much implemented. A right-click hook, so when you right-click, you could have something there. A blip menu hook. I mean, basically anywhere in the Wave UI, in the Wave client that there is buttons that the client provides, that's someplace that a developer potentially wants to hook into. So it depends what your particular client looks like, what hooks you're going to provide, but really developers wanted all of them. They wanted to be able to have drop-downs on the toolbar. It's pretty basic. And also a lot of them want configuration pop-ups, right? So before you insert the gadget, set some parameters. Before you add the robot, set some parameters, right? And I think you could implement that just as actually maybe a gadget itself, so that the user would say, toolbar hook, configuration gadget, and then insert gadget. And then maybe the gadget would get the configuration information in its state, right? I think that actually be pretty simple to do. Because then you would get experiences like, because we basically do something similar to this when you click like G+, right? That's kind of like a configuration thing, where I can go and select that, and that becomes something. So you can imagine using something like that for a gadget. One basic thing we wanted is that when somebody clicks the thing on the toolbar, we wanted to actually send the position that they were in when they clicked that to the extension. So they could do something like insert an image wherever they clicked. And a lot of people just wanted to do more and more actions. Like we have basic actions like insert gadget and add participant, but people said like, oh, can I add a tag? Can I set a title? Can I insert an image? So the thing is, like, people kept requesting these things, and we started realizing that they basically just wanted the robots API inside of the extension installer. And I didn't show it, but the extension installer is XML, right? So once again, we have another technology we're using. The other thing you could do is make this JSON. So you could think of some way of actually making it so you can embed robot code inside of the extension installer instead of having to invent new syntax for all these actions, because a lot of these actions are really mimicking the kind of things that robots can already do. So you might want to actually try and bring together robot API with this extension action API and maybe have it be the same thing. And then if you have it be JSON, then everything's JavaScript and whoo. The other thing is having a proper gallery, right? We decided to do this kind of weird thing where our gallery is actually, it's actually wave-based and everything's in a wave. And that was cool, I guess. But the problem with this is that meant we didn't have ratings, we didn't have reviews, and it wasn't obvious how to actually implement ratings and reviews on top of a wave-based gallery. I think actually if you're really going to have a gallery, you might want to just do it outside of Wave. Here's an example like of what it actually could look like, right? So we have, these are all the things. And look at that, I have categories over here, because that's something that we never really got to, is having categories. And then when you actually clicked on these, you could go and you could rate them and add comments, and you could see the number of users. So I think that if you're going to have extensions, you might want to just do an outside of Wave gallery, and then use something like the Wave This API to let people try the gadgets or install them. So this is about the discovery. We also wanted it so that if you were in a wave and somebody was using a gadget in the wave, you could just click on that gadget and say, I want that gadget, right? I want that extension. Maybe on every wave you'd see a list that said the extensions that are being used on this wave are this and this and this, and you would get a link to install it. Basically, if a user sees something being used on a wave that somebody else has put there, they should have a really easy way of installing that themselves, right? So that would help with discovery. Like, we had cool extensions, but I don't actually think that they got as much usage as they deserved because of discoverability. All right, so those are extensions API. We also had the embed API, which is just, really, it was just iframing the wave panel and putting it on the page using a JavaScript API. So this was the JavaScript API. This was actually the version 2 of the JavaScript API. And I think this is one of the starter projects for Wave in a Box, is actually to implement this. But yeah, it's basically create a new wave panel and load this wave. And you have a couple embed options like showing the header and footer, but it's a very basic API. So people would use it for embedding things on their wiki, in their content management system, for doing live waving. And really, when it came to features for the embed API, it was just all about customization of the user interface. People wanted different color schemes. Not every website is this, color of blue that Google uses everywhere. What they're displaying, like, people want to toggle this off and that off. They don't want to show blip contributors. They don't want to show timestamps. They don't want to show the participant panel. There's basically anything that you could possibly toggle on and off, they want to toggle on and off. For sizing, like, it was kind of awkward to embed waves because you had to guess what size they were going to be, but you can't guess what size a wave is going to be because people can add more stuff to that wave. So ideally, you could actually say just auto size this wave to be as big as it has to be as people add to it. Wouldn't be too hard to do. People wanted to be able to have comments collapse by default when they embed something. I wanted a kind of user interface which would be ideal for encouraging people to only follow a wave, right? Like for the kind of waves that are read-only and you're embedding them so that people can follow updates to them, like for the API changelog, I would like to just embed that, and there would just be a big follow button on that and nothing else, none of the rest of the UI, because there's nothing else they can really do to that wave besides follow it. So that's kind of using waves as like RSS feeds or Twitter streams. And then people also want to customize which part of the wave they're seeing, so being able to jump to a particular blip or even only embedding that particular blip, right? And we did actually introduce blip refs a few months ago, which means that you have an ID for each blip. So this actually wouldn't be too difficult to do now that we have that. And then people want to embed the search panel as well. We actually started with the ability to embed the search panel, but decided to focus on just single wave. Shouldn't be too hard to do it though. Then we have the data API, which is basically the robot API, but you authenticate as a user. And here I would say the feature requests are largely the same as the robot API. They wanted a bit more in terms of real-time operations and editing because people were using the data API to write their own clients. But besides that, since it is the same API, it was basically the same requests. All right, so besides those APIs, some other things we talked about. Forms. A lot of people were using Wave to do forms, collecting information from people, and processing that, adding some people on there. So we did have form elements in Wave. There was like input and password and radio and all of that. So that was one way of doing forms. But some people also did forms as gadgets, because then if you did a form as a gadget, you could implement your own, simple JavaScript stuff to say like, oh, if they did this, then we're going to show this, and if they said this, we're going to do this, and do some client-side verification. So there were kind of two competing ways of doing forms. In the end, we were thinking that the best way is probably still as gadgets, so that you have more control. And also, the other thing with a gadget is that you keep the arrangement of everything in the gadget. So this is what we were thinking. Now I just remembered. So we're thinking for a form, you want to have a form and you want people to fill out the form. So you do want them to be able to edit the wave, but you don't actually want them to be able to move around the elements in a wave, right? You don't want them to move this form element up here, and you don't want them to delete the gadget that is the form. Because right now, if they can edit the wave, they can edit everything. So we were thinking actually that the owner of a wave could lock certain elements in the wave and say, all right, this gadget is locked, right? They can't move it, they can't delete it. Or say like, all right, this input element, this text area is locked. They can't move it and they can't delete it. So then you can keep the structure of your wave and share that with somebody without worrying that they're going to accidentally delete parts of it. So it's almost like being able, the permission to add to something but not take away from it, right? And that can apply to more than just forms. And we're also thinking for gadgets. Right now, gadgets have a shared state, which are sub-children of the gadget element. Another thing you could do is actually just sync the gadget state to data documents, because it's very similar. Data documents are basically like hash maps of key values. So you could actually have the gadget state tied to these data documents, and then it becomes a little bit easier to interact with them as a robot. Another thing is that Dan was actually a big fan of getting developers to somehow use the doodad API, so that they weren't using gadgets to do everything, so they're actually making their own doodads to do stuff, and that would make it probably integrate a bit better with the rest of Wave. We were playing with actually Wave templates, which I saw the demo of, but didn't actually see how it works. But basically, you could mix and match HTML with elements of the Wave, so that you would open up a Wave and it would look like a blog page, but then parts of it would actually be editable parts of the Wave. And that was using Kaha, the thing we talked about earlier, but I don't really know exactly how it was working. But it looks cool, because that way people would really have big control over style of waves and be able to use it for more stuff. And then we're also thinking of doing a search, inbox rendering API. So right now your search results are rendered the same here. But imagine if you wanted, a developer wanted to actually do something like the extensions gallery, right? So that they wanted this custom display where you have the thumbnails, the titles, blah, blah, blah. So we could actually have an API where you would hand the developer the search results, or one search result, and the developer would say, render each search result like this, right? Maybe they'd specify some HTML, some template, and that way you could actually do custom displays for extensions. Like a to-do list extension, when you click on your items that you have to do, it'd be useful to to-do list extension could actually give you a search, give you a panel here that you could actually sort your tasks by priority, and actually visualize, when they're due on the side here, instead of having them look like normal waves. So that I think would have enabled people to really customize Wave a lot more for particular cases. All right, so those are some of the ones I was thinking of, but the cool thing is that we were tracking all of our bugs and feature requests externally. So if you are playing with the APIs, you might want to check out that list. Some of these things are actually really basic things that you know, if you guys are supporting the APIs, you should look at immediately. But some of them are somewhat farther out there, or just restructurings of the APIs entirely. But the APIs are cool. It's you know, I encourage you to actually just to think about what kind of what kind of apps you want developers to do. Think about whether your developers are internal or external, like how much you trust them, and that can influence what you actually do with the API. All right, thanks.